My name is Brian Garth, and I was for a long time the director of the American Bar Foundation. And I was there at the time that we brought this project to the foundation. It was going to be and was the first ever longitudinal national study of the legal profession. And so we took a group of those who graduated and passed the bar in 1999 or 2000, many years ago. And we started to follow them. So we've published many things out of this, many articles, but this is the first book. And this really was Bob Nelson's project to bring the book to fruition.
The research team began to meet and went through a very elaborate sampling approach in which we approached bar organizations in 18 different geographic areas and got lists of the lawyers who passed the bar in the year 2000. And then we drew a random sample of those lawyers. We were able to get information on race and ethnicity from the Law School Admissions Council, so we could get an oversample of attorneys of color, which is very helpful. And then we rolled out the first wave of the data collection. We also, all along, were doing a subsample of individuals who we were interviewing in depth, qualitative interviews. And so we have over 200 of those interviews. And we analyze all that data in this book. So bringing together both a kind of historical perspective on the profession and how it has changed from 2000 up to present, but then qualitative interviews, what we call the narrative chapters of the book, which is on how people made meaning of their careers, what their frustrations and successes were, but then also a lot of hard numbers about how much they make, where they're working, whether they're satisfied, the nature of their politics. And so that combination gives us a pretty powerful set of tools to analyze the legal profession and address the major research questions that we're interested in.
What we found from the qualitative interviews were things very consistent with the quantitative data, but they told us things that kind of went beyond the data, showed the experiences of people who were living the quantitative world. And so it was very rich, and I think it contributed a lot to the results of the project.
One of the women that we interviewed, Pamela, went to a top law school, graduated at the top of her class, and then was hired in a large corporate firm. After working at that firm for 3 or 4 years, she was promoted to non-equity partner. So that's good, but it's not as good as being an equity partner because you don't share in the profits as non-equity. However, as she worked very hard, she worked, as I recall, she might have billed 3,000 hours a year, which is extraordinary. And she did a lot of big clients, kind of in not litigation, but in mediation. And so she worked on very big cases, and she expected that she should eventually be promoted to equity partner. However, after they had this big success with a mediation, her clients that she had represented in that mediation did fine. But then the partners came to her and they said, well, thank you very much. We really appreciate it, but we don't think we need your services anymore. And they handed her a check and said, good luck. So I would say that women could be successful, but they more frequently than men met roadblocks and had to do much more than men to actually be accepted into equity partnership?
I think the After the JD study gives us a lot of information in terms of understanding the trajectory of women in the legal profession. One of the important topics, of course, is the gender pay gap. We find a gender pay gap among women and men, with men earning more than women from the moment women and men enter the legal profession. The reason it's important that we notice it then is because it is at a moment when women look like men. It is a moment before women are married or have children. And then that gap gets entrenched and grows in different ways and is established in different ways and gets enmeshed into different settings. But the fact that we notice it early on allows us to understand that this is a gap that is related to how the legal profession thinks about women and gender equality. Looking at the career paths of men and women, we see that there are a lot of similarities but important differences. Women tend to be overrepresented in career paths that are punctuated by unemployment. Women's career paths are also overrepresented by positions in legal services or in government. And yes, there are large portions of women in law firms and in business, but the data are very clear that women's advancements in those private sectors, in private law firms and in business, do not lead to the types of promotion possibilities and to the earnings that men get to experience. One of the surprising things that we learned in After the JD was not only about gender inequality in pay, for example, but we also learned that women continue in today's modern profession to report fairly negative experiences, especially racialized women, experiences of discrimination or sexual harassment. And I think it's really important to recognize that those experiences come, as they report to us, they come from their peers, but they also come in the workplace from judges or from clients. So I think it's important in terms of recognizing all the work on implicit bias and the kinds of judgments that are made about women, that at the same time that those experiences of implicit bias are happening, that women are continuing today to still report fairly significant explicit experiences of discrimination.
In one of the chapters in the book, we look at law firms as racialized organizations. And one striking statistic that we encountered was that 30% of the lawyers, there's a question that we asked in all our surveys about what is the demographic makeup of the people in your organization. And 30% of our sample in law firms said that, or maybe just across all practice settings, said that there were no people of color in their work organization. So they're completely white organizations. And for small firms, between 2 and 20 lawyers, that goes up to 60%. And so there are a lot of spaces within the legal profession in which there are no people of color, which is quite striking. Some of that has to do with regional variation, that sometimes we're looking at small cities, etc. But I think that's, quite dramatic. On the question of why fewer lawyers of color make partner, I think the standard answer that a lot of large firm managers like to say is that the minorities go elsewhere. It's hard for us to recruit them, then they get other opportunities and they leave, as though that's just a voluntary choice. What we found from very detailed job history data that we collected was that it's the core practices of law firms that drive minority attorneys out. And so 6 years into their careers, African Americans and whites have very similar profiles in terms of making partner. But by 6 years later, whites are much more likely to have made partner and African Americans are much more likely to have left. And the reason we can pinpoint this is that the African Americans compared to their white counterparts get less client inheritance, get less training, get less mentoring, and as a result of that, they leave or are pushed out. And so it's a very different story. It's a somewhat disturbing story, but one that I think leaders of law firms need to hear and learn from. and then try and take actions to redress some of those issues.
One of the striking features of this book is that it underscores that notwithstanding a lot of changes on the surface or at the entry level, that many of the underlying structures of the profession have changed relatively little in the almost 20 years that we've been studying this cohort of lawyers. And that's particularly the case for minority lawyers in general and black lawyers in particular. And when we look at almost every turn, whether it's making partner in law firms, whether it's earnings, whether it's debt levels and the ability to pay off debt, that blacks have done consistently less well than whites, and almost consistently less well across the board than other groups. So I've been studying the careers of black lawyers in law firms now, even longer than I've been working on the After the JD, which is a very long time now, almost 40 years. And although we have seen progress on the entry level and some progress overall, we haven't seen nearly as much progress as I think people would have expected. And the question is why? And one of the persistent findings, both in our survey data and also in the many, many wonderful qualitative interviews, is that although people are let in the door, they're never fully welcomed and incorporated. That many lawyers, but let's focus particularly on black lawyers, often feel that they are not included within the main fabric of the firm, whether that's for work assignments or for introductions to clients or for opportunities, that their conduct is judged more harshly than it would be if a similar mistake had been made by a white lawyer. And that at the bottom, law firms still are looking for people who fit into their understanding of what a good lawyer is. And that has turned out to be something that black lawyers often feel, and I think the evidence suggests that they are correct, are not seen as being the right fit for these organizations, particularly at the senior levels.
So broadly speaking, there are two main findings on student debt in lawyers' careers. The first involves who has student debt and how much, and the second involves the impact of student debt on lawyers' career choices. So first, we find an uneven distribution of student debt among lawyers from different social groups. We examine student debt over the course of lawyers' careers and find that advantages and disadvantages related to social class background and race and ethnicity accumulate over the course of lawyers' early careers, with law school rank playing an important moderating and mediating role in student loan borrowing and repayment. Second, we test the assumption that student debt steers lawyers away from careers in public service and toward the private sector. And we fail to find empirical support for the claim that student debt has a direct impact on where lawyers launch their careers. So we find that 87% of law school graduates graduate with some student debt, and that this figure is much higher for African American and Latinx respondents whose parents have lower levels of education, and respondents who graduated from lower ranked law schools. Among those respondents who graduated with any debt, we find an average debt load of $71,000. But again, this figure is higher for African American and Latinx respondents, as well as respondents whose parents have lower levels of education, with one exception, which is respondents whose parents have a high school diploma or less. We hypothesize that this finding may reflect the allocation of needs-based scholarships for students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, as we also find that students whose parents had a high school diploma or less received a higher proportion of their law school funding from scholarships.